Board of Retirement meeting for November 2nd, 2022. First off, we will do a roll call.
All right, Ms. Covison.
Here.
Mr. Hawkins is absent. Ms. Cavanis.
Here.
Mr. Dirty.
Present.
Thank you. Ms. Smith.
Here.
Mr. Cromer.
Here.
Mr. Shoemaker.
Here.
Ms. Harris. Here. And Mr. Anderson.
Here. He snuck in the door just in time.
Excellent.
Okay, since he's late, would you like to lead us in the pledge of
There
allegiance?
you go.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic
For it stands,
one
one
nation,
nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice.
Sorry, Jim. All righty, we are open to public comment on anything that is not on the agenda this morning.
It does not appear that we have any public comment at this time.
All right. Well, let's move on then. Our first item on the agenda is a resolution authorizing teleconference meetings pursuant to Government Code 54953 and Assembly Bill 361. I have a motion to approve the resolution.
Move approval, Madam Chair.
Second.
Thank you. Is there any discussion or public comment regarding the teleconferencing?
Well, there's no public comment.
Then let's take a roll call vote.
Great, Ms. Covison? Ms. Covison?
Sorry, yes.
Thank you. Ms. Cavanis?
Yes.
Mr. Dirty?
Yes.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mr. Cromer?
Aye.
Mr. Shoemaker?
Aye.
Ms. Harris?
Aye.
Approved.
So we have, since we only met 2 weeks ago, we have 2 things on the consent calendar. The consent agenda has the minutes of the October 19th meeting and the quarterly trustee education and training report. So is there any comments or conversation, or do you want to pull anything off consent? Because we have to vote on it, but if there's no comments, we can adopt it by unanimous consent.
Does not appear there's any comments, nor public comment.
Thank you. I don't think the next item is going to go that fast, right? So we're on to item number 3, discussion and possible action regarding the June 30th, 2022 actuarial valuation study. So Andy, I'm going to turn it over to you and your colleague.
Okay. Good. Thank you, Madam Chair and other members of the Retirement Board. My name is Andy Young. I'm joined by my partner, Dirk Adamson. So we will be presenting actually 2 reports. First, starting off with the funding valuation, where I will be doing most of the presentation. So with that, I will try to share my screen because I have the valuation report loaded up. So just please let me know when the valuation report comes up on the screen.
It's there.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I'm going to just go through a couple of highlights of this year's valuation. First, start off by going to page 5 of our valuation report. The premise of this year's valuation are based on the plan benefit provisions which are adopted by the plan sponsors and administered by the Board of Retirement. And as we would always like to say, at least as part of this valuation, we are not asking the board, for example, on what assumptions to use for the valuation, because some of the board members may remember you make the decision to, for example, on what interest rate, such as a 6.75% for use in the funding valuation, or how long our members are expected to live. We call that the mortality tables. those decisions are usually made at the time of the triennial experience study. So the last triennial experience study were performed about 3 years ago. So this is actually the last year that we will be taking, or we have taken the assumptions that the board approved from the last triennial experience study, and we have used those assumptions again for the last time in this particular evaluation. So one thing to keep in mind though is Dirk and I will be appearing in front of the board again, although not until the first or second quarter of next year, where we will be looking at all the actuarial assumptions again, including interest rate, inflation assumption, COLA assumptions, and how long our members are going to live after they retire, etc., at the time of the next triennial experience study. So until the experience study, we are going to again apply the same assumptions that the board approved almost like 3 years ago. Last but not least, in this valuation, we have also applied the funding policy that was last reviewed by the board as part of 2018. So by the way, as some of the board members may remember, last year at the request of the board, we have been asked to go in and look at several ways that would allow the plan to become better funded by quite candidly increasing the employer's contributions, and also in the process save interest that would otherwise have to be paid. And this is in regard to the funding of the UAL. So as a result of the decisions made by the board, we talk about that at the bottom of page 6 of the report. The board has decided, and the employers have concurred with the board, to basically shorten the amortization period for one of the layers that we will talk about later on in this presentation, which will require the employer to increase the contribution requirement by about $1.5 million. So I think that recommendations from the board was quite well received by all the employers, because the employers understand why the board would choose to increase the contribution requirement. Again, the motivation was to just make sure that the plan will become fully funded sooner rather than later. So with that as a backdrop, in this valuation, we are providing the same type of information that would be required in order for the board to pass on to the employers, and in order for the board to pass on to our members what the contribution rate would be for the upcoming 2023-24 fiscal year. So in other words, even though this valuation was done as of June 30, 2022, taking all the membership data, taking all the financial information as of June 30, 2022, but of course we know that it will take the employer and our members some time before this contribution rate would become effective. So that's why there's a 1-year delay. Now, by the way, I forgot to mention, of course, these presentation that Dirk and I have done for so many years, very loosely script. So if there are any questions that want me to stop, or if I'm going too fast or too slow, please let me know, and I can certainly address your question as we move along. So with that as a backdrop, I'm going to take a look at a couple of pages in the valuation high-level summary, although I'm going to be jumping to the couple of pages in the report very quickly. But from 30,000 feet, what happened is, in this year's evaluation, we have made some progress in the funding of the plan. We measure the funding progress.
I'm sorry, Andy, one moment.
Good.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So we have measured the funding progress of the plan by looking at one of two things. We can either look at that by the so-called funding ratio, where we take the assets of the plan and divide that by the total liability. So the funding ratio that we come up with this year was 73.2%. So very roughly speaking, this means that for every dollar worth of liability, we now have 73.2 cents of assets to cover that liability. Last year, the number was 73. So you can say that, well, we make some incremental progress. On the other hand, we have always measured the funding ratio using the so-called market value of assets. So as I will go into another page in the report in the next several minutes, in the valuation, we know that it is always very difficult to set the employer and the members' contribution rate by using the market value of assets. So for that reason, the board has approved as part of the funding policy the so-called 5-year assets moving method. So the way the methodology works is any year where the rate of return, the actual market rate of return, come in either higher or lower than the expected rate of return, which for this valuation is 6.75%, we go ahead and only recognize 20% of those better or worse than expected return in any year. So with the end outcome that the contribution rate that we would set using this so-called smooth actuarial value of assets would be smoother than using the market value. So we don't want to lose sight of the fact that for the funding of the plan, at the end of the day, it is only the market value of assets that can be used to pay benefits for our retirees and for our members who demand a refund of the contribution. So that's why we've always measured the funding status on the market value as well. So this is the funding ratio that I like to draw your attention to, because we have suffered some setback. Last year, when Dirk and I were presenting the valuation to the board, we were sitting on a quite amount of deferred investment gains that we have not yet recognized. 2021 was a great year. Because it was such a great year, we were becoming very skeptical. And with the benefit of hindsight, I think that skepticism was a good thing, because we decided not to use all the market returns that were in excess of the assumed rate in setting the employer's contribution rate. Because if we were to do that, the funding status was much higher. It was coming in at about 84.9%. So 84 cents, close to 85 cents of assets for each dollar worth of liability. But look what 1 year a difference would it make, because the funding status actually has now dropped to 71.4%. So later on in the report, I will explain what does that mean to have a somewhat different funding status between the smooth value of assets and the market value of assets. So with that with that in mind, I also talk about another way to measure the funding status would be just compare the absolute dollar amount of those assets with the liability. If we look at the dollar differences, that difference was $221.6 billion in the last valuation. And in this year's valuation, actually, we have not made too much of a progress, because the amount of the unfunded liability was about $233.9 billion. Now, rather than to read off to you very dense text as to what are the reasons behind the change in the UAAL amount, so I'm going to now turn to page 31 of the report. So I'm just going to jump to several pages in the report as we go along. So this page of the report shows how we reconcile the change in the unfunded actuarial accrued liability. And again, the unfunded actuarial accrued liability is a measure of the difference between how much liability we have in the plan versus assets on a smooth value basis after going through this so-called 5-year asset smoothing method that I was talking about. So in the last valuation, the amount of the unfunded liability was about $221 million. Now, if all the actuarial assumptions were to be met, including the payment of normal costs, including the payment of receiving a contribution from both the employer and the employees and adjusting with interest, we would have unfunded liability of about $215 billion. So if all the actuarial assumptions were to be met, the amount of the unfunded liability actually would have dropped by about $6 million from 221 to $215 million. However, in this case, during 2020, 21, 22, not all the actuarial assumptions have been met. So that's why there's an increase in the unfunded liability in round dollar terms of about 18 million, which carry us from 215 to about $233 million. So with that, let's go in and figure out why we have an $18 million net increase in the unfunded liability. First, I was talking early on about the fact that in the 2021 valuation, because we were so skeptical that the market may take back some of the gains that we get back in year 2021. So we used this 5-year asset smoothing methodology. And because of the fact that we were having so much gain as of that point in time, so even after we take into account the market losses from 2022, which came in at about negative 9.7%, call it negative 10%, we still have a net amount of gain for 2021-22. So the amount of return on a smooth value basis was about 7.8%. So our benchmark, our assumption was 6.75. The market actually returned negative 9.72. Because of assets moving, we now have a net positive return of about 7.79, which is about 1% better than what we expect. So on a net basis, we still have some incremental good news to share with the employers, and the investment performance was better than expected. It contributed to about a negative about a $6 million reduction in the unfunded liability. On the other hand, anytime where we have a positive, that means we are adding to the UAAL, and I have to be quick to admit that what is bad for the plan may be looked at as being good to the participant. So for example, in the item 6B, we have individual salary increases, which are coming in higher than expected. So this actually should not be a surprise to the employer, and for that matter, even to some of the board members who were around, because 3 years ago, we were informed by the employers that after having not been able to pass on any salary increases to our active members, there were finally some monies available. There were finally some salary comparisons that were made. And as a result, back 3 years ago, we were informed by the employers that these salary increases that have recently been agreed to that back then with the bargaining groups are going to trigger in incrementally. So for the last two valuations, there have been salary increases measured against our long-term assumptions, which are actually higher than those assumptions. So last year, I think this amount was about $9 million, $10 million, and the year before was $6 million. So bottom line is that there were salary increases given to our active members, which were higher than expected by the actuarial assumptions. So definitely good news for the employees, but at least when measured on the fund perspective, it adds on to the actuarial and funded liability, and the amount that we added this year was about $10 million. So the next item here is almost the same for the retirees. At least those retirees who are in the legacy plan, the board could grant up to a 3% cost of living adjustments to those retirees subject to the actual change in the CPI. And as we mentioned, for the longest time, that 3% COLA have not been granted. However, that was not the case for April 1 of 2022, because for that, on that date, the change in the CPI when measured using these metrics that we talk about in the footnote came in at 7%. Because 7% was much higher than the 2.75% inflation assumption that we have used in the valuation. As a result, there was an actuarial loss. And again, this is one of those things that is definitely good news for our retirees. Well, even though I would not call inflation being good news for our retirees, but at least the pensions for the retirees have gone up by up to the 3% that was in the plan. But because the actual increase in the CPI were greater than the inflation assumption of 2.75%, so what's going to happen is the liability now we will have to be remeasured. And not only that, but because COLA was higher than what the members can reasonably get in 1 year, right, which I said is the 3%. So the difference between the 7 and the 3% is set aside and is recorded in a so-called COLA bank. So if we were to come in next year that the inflation were to finally come down, which I don't think it is the case based on the treasury that we are looking at right now, but if we were to come down, then the retirees would be able to draw on the COLA bank and to basically have up to a 3% COLA, and it would take some time if our assumptions were to be coming through at 2.75% inflation, it would be some years before the full 4% would be fully reflected. So in the grand scheme of things, we have built that loss into the liability, and that amount was about $11 million. So there's always a 1 year delay between when the contribution rate is recommended by the actuary and paid by the employer. So that's why there is always some years where the contribution rates are going down, such as what happened in year 2021. There's always going to be some kind of an actuarial gain, and it could go the other way. So the last item is a catch-all category. It has to do with other experience losses, although in this case, as we talk about in the footnote and in the body of the report, there were some adjustments to the membership data that was made by the Retirement Association. Some of that as a result of some correction programs that the MSERA has decided to participate in. So it gave rise to an actuarial loss. So bottom line is, if you look at the change in UAL, some of the changes were higher than what we expected, and you can almost narrow it down to salary increases coming in higher, COLA increases coming in lower, although some of those losses were mitigated by the investment returns better than expected. So we still have a little bit of that, and this might be the last year where we have those investment gains that we can count on to reduce the UAL. So with that, let me pause because I'm going to then go through a very similar looking page, although we will be looking at changes in the employer rate. But before I go there, let me just pause to see if there are any questions on this unfunded liability reconciliation that I've done.
Trustee Jervy.
Yeah, so Andy, looking forward to the next 3-year triennial study, if, for example, the background inflation projection was elevated from 2.75 to 3%, or even 3.5%, would that both take into account future COLAs for the retirees? I know that in one given year, retirees cannot receive more than a 3% COLA, but as in this case, they bank the surplus for future COLAs. So it's highly likely, it seems to me, that retirees who retired in this year or were already retired prior to this year with the 4% banked, and knowing that we've historically had COLAs for the retirees of 2.5% to 3% each year, it seems to me it's highly likely that they're, with that 4% bank, that they're, and perhaps banking more this coming year, that they're going to be seeing 3% COLAs, for the next 10, 15, 20 years. And so given that, could it be seen as prudent if the next triennial study put the CPI at 3 or even higher?
I think perhaps the short answer is Seagull has one inflation assumption, which we use for all of our California public retirement system clients. And as you will see in the report that Dirk and I will be preparing in the first and second quarter of 2023, what would happen is we're going to come in spite of the relatively high inflation that we have seen. I think it was starting in the last quarter of 2021. It is coming through the second half, or maybe the second quarter of 2022. Although the good news, at least from the plan's perspective, is looks like inflation is finally brought under control. And of course, we are aware that the Feds have done all the kinds of tightening, right, by increasing the interest rate to make that happen. They have increased the interest rate, I think, 4 times already, and they expected to do more, I think, as soon as today. So I think Fed would do everything they can in their power to drive down the inflation, even though we are not an economist and we don't know what's going to happen. Because Seagull only has one inflation assumption that we recommend to all of our clients. So in spite of the high inflation, I think we'll make a strong case, at least try to make a strong case to the board, why we think that inflation should continue to be reflected with a downward trend of 2.5%, because that's what we have been recommending, and other retirement system boards have adopted our recommendation to move their then current 2.75% inflation to 2.5%. However, because we know that we are living in a very high price area, our retiree COLAs are set by the board based on the Western region change in the CPI. So for the first time in the experience studies that we have been doing for those clients, we have actually introduced a margin to recognize that inflation, whereas we set the inflation of the 2.5 based on US city averages. However, we have been following the US Western region to set the COLA for our retirees. So for that reason, even though we're recommending that CPI price inflation be reduced down to 2.5, but at least for the purpose of predicting the COLA, we are going to recommend that we stay put at 2.75. So short answer is we think that we will be changing the inflation assumption, at least the price inflation that we use to set investment return assumption, among other things. However, for setting the COLA, we were going to be recommending, after all the changes, a status quo recommendation. But I don't think we would recommend that we go back to, for example, 3% or 3.25 or something like that. And then we will provide the board with all the information that you have, among others, that Seagull is one of the last consulting firms to lower the inflation assumption, and some of the other actuaries have already gone down to 2.25%. And if you ask what has CalPERS done lately, and in the early part of 2021, they actually lowered the assumption to 2.3%. So arguably, you can say that Seagull, you're being way too conservative with the 2.75% inflation assumption that we're using right now for this valuation.
So appreciate that, and I look forward to more discussion on this. But we also know that some of the other plans have different ways of allocating the COLAs. I believe, I could be wrong, I believe Sonoma County, or at least some of the MSARAs or SARAs, actually allocate the COLA based on available funding. So if funding is not available, a COLA of up to, say, 3% it's
Mhm.
still not allocated if the funds are not available, regardless of whether or not the plan performance is exceeding expectations or meeting expectations.
Mhm.
We are obligated to provide the COLA of up to 3%. And as again, I think, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that probably every single classic employee who's either yet to retire or who has retired, given the banking that they've taken and given the Western region, but it's extremely likely, it seems to me, that they're looking at 3% COLAs for at least a decade.
Okay, yeah, duly noted. And then now again, the one other thing that I want to emphasize is the fact that we have some members now with a 4% COLA bank. So those COLA banks actually have been taken into consideration when we project the liability. So the reason why the loss is so great, $12 million, is because even if inflation were to come in at 2.75, according to our assumption, we are expecting those retirees with a 4% COLA bank to be able to spend 0.25% of those COLA banks in each of the next, guess what, 16 years in order to receive a 3% COLA benefit. So all that have been fully reflected in this calculation. So if the CPI were to come in at only 2.75% next year, and I make no guarantee, because based on the number that we are seeing today, it is going to be another high year of inflation. But even if that were to be the case, the fact that we have retirees with a up to 4% COLA bank, those have the liability associated with paying those high COLA higher than the 2.75% up to the 3%. That's already fully reflected in the $11 million of unfunded liability.
Oh, appreciate this. But again, if there's another 7% Western region CPI, they'll bank another 4%, which then means another 16 years. So now you're talking 32 years of 3% COLAs for those retirees. So I'm just saying, I'm not so sure that it's prudent to stick with something less than 3% at this point.
Okay, so we'll have more discussion, I'm sure, that at the time when we present the next experience study.
Okay.
So to stay on Dan's point for a moment, what you're saying is in line item 6.3, that $12 million there has a consideration for the banking, whereas if you were in Sonoma County, that number, because they don't have that banking, would be lower. Is that correct?
Yeah, so as a matter of fact, Richard, if we were to look at the Sonoma County valuation report prepared by Siegel, you would not see an item 6C. And the reason why that is the case is that Sonoma County is one of the only 37 Act retirement system county where even for the legacy members, they don't have a COLA. The statutory COLA is basically a big 0%. So it doesn't really matter, at least from the plan's perspective, what the actual change in the CPI is, because over at the Sonoma County Retirement Board, they don't have any authority to grant any statutory COLA to their members, legacy members, and their PEPR members. So for that reason, even though inflation was such high, it definitely hurts our retirees, if it hurts their retirees, but the board has no authority to provide any COLA, statutory COLA. So what happened is, when times were difficult, the retirees basically were settled with basically inflation in the price of groceries and other services that they have to purchase, but they're not going to get any compensation whatsoever from the retirement system. On the other hand, when times were back to normal, or maybe we even earn more than the assumed rate, then the Board of Retirement at Sonoma will have some flexibility in deciding whether or not they would be willing and able to expense some assets from the plan. We call that excess earnings allocation, to at least provide for some measure of replacement of loss in purchasing power. But I have to admit that over at Sonoma County, because they don't have the whereabouts to do that for almost like 15 years now. So for that reason, the only thing that happened at this system was that the retirees are seeing erosion in the purchasing power. So you don't see this item on the balance sheet, on the reconciliation at Sonoma County Employee Retirement Association. So that's good news for the plan. But the companion news for the retirees over that system is that they are not seeing any replacement of the income, because there was no way to to make any replacement.
So I'm gonna put this in hopefully a yes or no answer. If we, in item 6C, if there is the same amount of considered inflation, 7%, that number next year would probably be $24 million or slightly less. Yes, no.
I think no, because if inflation were to come in again at 7, right,
But
we will be banking 4%. So the number that we will see next year will be about 12 million again.
thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate the questions. Okay,
Trustee
so
Harris.
Andy, come from a system that doesn't have a COLA bank. How many of 37 Act, CalSTRS has a fee simple, 2% uncompounded, and what is supposedly making up for loss of purchasing power is when your pension drops below 85% of what you've retired at, then you get a little bonus. I called to inquire about my little bonus because I've been retired for 20 years and never got one. Strangely enough, 3 days later, I got a letter in the mail that said I was due for the bonus. It was very much appreciated, but it's a poor retirement as far as looking at COLA. Never heard of a bank other than when we have our presentation. So how many of the 37 Act programs have a bank?
so we do have the bank at virtually all the 37 Act systems, with the exception of Sonoma County Employee Retirement Association. Yeah, and again, the only reason why we don't produce a letter, a banking letter for the scale report is because that information really is not going to be helpful for the board for its administration of the fund. I know that the staff at Sonoma keep tracks of the loss in the purchasing power, because hopefully one of those days will come, and it will be sooner rather than later, at least from the perspective of the retirees, where we would be able to identify, first we have to identify the source of funds available to make those loss in purchasing power COLA. But once the source of fund is identified, then we will need to target the retirees that needs the money the most. So I know that the banking mechanism has been set up. So for example, at other jurisdictions back when times were good, we would be able to look at retirees who have lost up to, for example, 15% or 20% purchasing power. And then those retirement board would be able to consider whether or not they would want to and have the funds available to make up for the loss in purchasing power for those retirees. But I have to admit that because the source of funds have dried up quite, at least for the last 5-10 years, not too many retirement boards have been able to do that. I think the only exception that I'm aware of is through the work that we have been doing at Orange County Employee Retirement System, that retirement board has been able to do that. And they, quite candidly, the only way that they get around doing that is because every time they identify retirees who have lost at least a 15% in purchasing power, they actually approach the employers at Orange County and the other participating employers and ask those employers, would you be willing to spend extra dollars, make additional contributions so that your retirees' purchasing power can be made up by contributions that you make specifically. So I think the only system that we are aware of that have been able to routinely make up for those losses in the purchasing power in the COLA bank is Orange County Employee Retirement System. But otherwise, very few systems have the whereabouts to do that, at least in the last maybe 10 years or so.
Trustee Anderson.
Yeah, and I don't know if this is for you, Andy, or for staff, but for some perspective as well, I believe that until this last year and in the current year, we probably went almost 2 decades, 15 years, 2 decades without banking anything in a COLA bank. And the only people who were drawing off the COLA bank were those that retired like prior to the year 2000. Does that sound about right?
I think that is right. So Dirk can check me with if I'm wrong, but you're right that for the longest time, until the uptick in inflation in the last quarter of 2021, I think inflation appears to be well under control, and very few retirees actually have seen a bank being built up. So yeah, so I think it is happening, definitely, no doubt about that. It's very painful when it happens, but I would admit that it is a relatively recent phenomenon. So I don't want to dismiss the fact that 2022 could end up be one of those years, because again, when I look at the change in the CPI for the Western region, there's no denying of the fact that we are still, even though inflation is brought under control in the third quarter of 2022, but because inflation have gone up so much in the first and the second quarter of 2022, I would not be surprised if 2022 would end up to be one of those years where inflation would still come in at about 7%.
Trustee Jardine?
Yeah, so I understand what Director Anderson said, that it's been some time since there's been banking, but I think it's also true that that the CPI for the Western region, and before that, the Bay Area that was used by MSARA, showed that if you looked retrospectively, that COLAs were either 2.5%, maybe 1 out of 3 years, and 3%, 2 out of 3 years. So it was very close to the 3% COLA virtually every single year. And so that's what I'm saying, because we seem to, at least our Western region, seem to be so close to 3% virtually every year, that any banking is going to effectively almost guarantee a 3% COLA. Again, you've indicated it's likely to last 16 years in your analysis. A second 4% banking is therefore likely to last another 16 years. So it's not a matter of how often is percentages banked, but for how long will that more or less guarantee a 3% COLA, as far as the eye can see, is the issue. And so my concern is, if we stick with something less than a 3% COLA, knowing it's extremely likely that for perhaps most of our lifetimes, the lifetime of most of us here on this board, that they're going to be 3% COLA for classic employees, it just doesn't seem prudent to me. But and just as an aside on Orange County, a difference between Orange County and the county of Mendocino, I believe something like 90% of the people who live in Orange County live within a city and not in an unincorporated area. And that means that roads are maintained by cities, not by the county. A lot of services are delivered by cities, not by the county. In Mendocino County, one reason why Mendocino County's finances are very different from Sonoma County or Orange County is because 2 out of 3 residents of Mendocino County live outside of a city. And we are in a geographically large county, but a small population county. So I guess I get envious anytime I hear about a county like Orange County that has all oodles of money and relatively few obligations, whereas Mendocino County has oodles of obligations and very few dollars.
Thanks, Dan. Any further questions on this or comments on this particular item? Then Andy, I would suggest we move forward then.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. So I will apologize for bringing up. I know that the inflation is a very important topic, but we would definitely be reporting back to the board at the time of the experience study. Would provide you with more information. So I think now I'm going to go to page 33 of the valuation report. So what we have tried to do is to take all those items that we have already talked about and provide the contribution rate impact. So I'm not going to go through line by line, because some of the items that we talked about early on are actually represented on this page as well. For example, the fact that we have earned on the after asset smoothing a rate of return, which is about 7.79% better than the 6.75% that we have expected. That has done good things to the plan, that reduced the contribution rate by about 0.5% of payroll. And we saw the impact of the higher than expected salary increases on our active members and the higher cost of living adjustment increases for our retirees. So no surprise to everybody that those actually go the opposite direction, that increase the contribution rate. Now, the one item that is Perhaps noteworthy is that anytime where we develop an additional unfunded liability, and for that matter, for any unfunded liability that we carry forward from last year's valuation to this year's valuation, those contributions that are required to pay off the unfunded liability are then spread as a percentage of payroll. So in other words, we first figure out, go to a schedule at the back of the report, several minutes. We'll go to the back of the report in the next several minutes to talk about how the UAAL for the plan will be paid off over time. But once we determine the annual contribution amount, those amounts are then taken and spread as a percentage of payroll. So anytime where the payroll for the plan is going up more than what we expect, we actually would expect the contribution rate to go down or vice versa. So in this case, for this year, by amortizing the UAAL over the payroll, we actually got a little bit of a reduction. Now, in the front of the report, I'm not going to go back to the front of the report as of yet. We make mention of the fact that the growth in the salary for our three membership group, meaning the general, the safety, and the probation, are actually quite non-uniform. So I think for the first time, for many years, after many years now, we observed that the payroll for our probation members actually is going up by about 12.5% of pay. So I think if I remember correctly, for the last several valuations, I think the headcount in the probationary unit, as well as the payroll for that unit, actually have not gone up by the assumed salary increase assumption of 3.25%. But for this year's valuation, payroll has gone up much faster than what we expected. I think that there must have been additions to the headcount that have taken place within the county. So as a result, for that unit, you will see that the contribution rate to the unfunded actuarial accrued liability, or the UAAL, has actually gone down. On the other hand, if you look at the payroll for the safety, the payroll for the safety has not gone up as expected. It has only gone up by about 1.7%. So it goes both ways, right? If you take the amount of contribution that needs to be paid towards the amortizing UAL and you spread it over a payroll base, which has only gone up by 1.7% and not the 3.25% that we've expected, then for that unit, that contribution rate to UAL actually is going up. It is going to have to go up because we're taking the same, even if we would take the same UAL dollars and spreading it over now a smaller payroll. So for general, the payroll has gone up by 5%. So everything else being equal, you would expect to see some positive impact rate reduction as a result of the payroll for the generals going up higher than expected. So I only make mention of that because if you just look at this line item, it might be construed as being misleading because every employer might come in for the three membership groups may look at this and say, according to our actuary, the payroll rate for the UAAL is going down because payroll is going up higher than expected. So that is only partially true with respect to the general and with respect to the probation, because for the safety, their payroll did not go up as high as what we expected. So therefore, the contribution rate for the UAL is actually going up this year as a result of that. So now I'm going to, unless there are any questions on this reconciliation, which again, item for item looks very similar to the page that we were looking at when we were looking at the UAL reconciliation. So I'm now going to just skip over to page 34, where we provide a similar reconciliation for the member rate. So for the member rate, then you can see, it's kind of a little bit boring, right? Because there's only one item on this page. It really has to do with the effect of change in membership demographics. And even if you look at this item, it is a very small impact of only reducing the members rate on the average by about 3 basis points for $28,000. Now, the reason why the member rates page reconciliation is actually very short, it is due to the fact that for our members, they are only responsible for paying a contribution rate calculated using all the actuarial assumptions that we recommend that the board approve at the time of the last experience study, assuming all the assumptions were to be met. So in other words, when times were good, but we still have a little bit of good news, when the investment return experience were coming in slightly positive this year, and it was very positive the year before, the employers never share in that positive actuarial experience. And likewise, if we have retiree COLA increases greater than expected, or active member salary increases greater than expected, the members are not responsible for paying additional contribution to that effect as well. So the only time where those events that I mentioned, for example, the cost of living adjustment or the salary increase greater than expected, is if and when we were to recommend to the board, such as what we may do at the time of the next experience study, change the inflation assumption or change the salary increase assumption to reflect the most recent year's experience. If we were to make those recommendations, and if the board were to approve those recommendations, those assumptions would then be utilized to calculate the expected experience of the plan. So that really is the only time when you would expect to see some wholesale changes in the member contribution rates. Otherwise, any favorable or, for that matter, unfavorable actuarial experience really would not impact the member contribution rate setting process. Okay. So I think with that, I will just visit one page, two more pages on the report with you very quickly. I'm going to go to page 76 of the report because I mentioned how important the board, I think will agree with me, how important the UAL is, the payment for that UAL is for the plan. So I just want to highlight for the board that at the back of the report, we show on page 76, there's actually, by the way, a different page that I'm not going to go through for each of the general, safety, and probation units. So you can actually see how much of unfunded liability we have in each of those three membership groups. But for the plan as a whole, I'm just going to stay focused on the plan as a whole. The total amount of unfunded liability we have was about $233 million. So the annual payment amount that would be required would be $22 million. So you can roughly say about 1/10 of the UAL for the plan is now going to be paid off each year with the contributions that we're asking the employer to pay. Now, of course, I should be quick to admit that even though that's a very a rough justice number, because anytime where the unfunded liability is not paid off in annual contributions, of course, the board will charge the employer interest at the rate of 6.75% to service that debt. So suffice to say that this year's payment calculated according to the amortization schedule was about $22 million. Now this year, we saw this number a few minutes ago, we have a net experience loss, and that's $18 million. So what we did was we take the $18 million in new unfunded liability, we amortize that using the policy that was last reaffirmed by the board in 2018, and the payment required to pay off that new additional piece of UAL was about $1.3 million, $1.4 million. So there's a nice chart at the back of the after this page, which shows you how the UAL that we currently have, about $233 million, would be paid off over time. So of course, those payments will come at those UAL will be paid at the expense of the employer, right? So the contributions that would be required for the next almost 2 decades are provided on this page. Now you will see that the contributions are actually going up over time instead of being flat, right? So if we were to look at the mortgages, for example, for our house, you would expect the payments to stay flat, but this is not the case. So unlike the mortgages on our houses where we use a level dollar amortization, the bank would only allow us to use a level dollar. But in this case, we have taken the UAL amount and we have actually amortized that, assuming that the payroll for the county and for the other participating employers will actually increase at the rate of 3.25% each year. So the increase in the dollar contribution each year is at the rate of 3.25%. So that's why you can see that the dollar amounts are expected to go up. So this goes back to my earlier statement. To the extent that the employer payroll does not go up by 3.25% each year, that it would make paying off the mortgage appears to be more costly because we take the payments that are going up by 3.25%, and if the payroll, which is in the denominator, does not go up by 3.25%, then the percentage of payroll rate will go up over time. Okay, so now I think I'm going to maybe go back to one other section of the report, and then maybe finish my prepared remarks. So I'm going to go to page 22 of the report. So this is the place where I said early on, because we don't trust the market value, at least in setting the employer's contribution rate. So for that reason, we have used a so-called 5-year assets moving methodology. So the way it works is, just very briefly, as a refresher to some of the members who have been on the board for some time and for our new board members. So what happened was I'm going to talk about first the good year first. In 2021, the actual return for the fund is $166 million. We actually only expect the fund to earn about $46 million if we were to earn the assumed rate of 6.75%. But because we earned more than the 36 million, and the amount that we out-earned the assumption was $130 million. So what happened was, in the 2021 valuation, we only recognized 20% of these superior investment returns. So with the end outcome that now this is the second year, right, in a row that we're recognizing those gains from 2021. So that's why of the amount that we have earned more than the assumption, the 130 million, we have now recognized 20% or 2 years worth of investment gains. So that's why we are left with 60% of that amount that have still been unrecognized. So had it not been for the fact that we have a bad year for 2022, then you can see that, well, if we look at all the prior years, excluding 2022, at least for the time being, you can say, okay, well, there's just more good news to be recognized in the next several years. So that's great, right? However, 2022 did happen. 22, what happened was the actual return, because it turned out to be negative 9.some%, call it negative 10%. So the actual return for the year was coming in at a net loss of about $67 million, whereas we expect the fund to earn $46 million. So in most, if you talk to your investment consultant, they will come to you and report, well, 2022 was a bad year because you lost $67 million. However, from the actuary's perspective, because we have been discounting the liabilities at 6.75%, the news that we are coming to the board today is actually worse than a loss of 67 million. So relative to how much we expect the fund to earn and how much the fund actually did earn or loss, you can see that the sum of these two is a net loss of $114 million. So in the valuation, we treat the good news and bad news alike. So what happened was, in this valuation, we have only, in air quotes, of course, recognized 20% of those losses. So that means that we are deferring, for recognition purposes, 80% of the $114 million. So it's about 91 million. So because 91 was much greater, right, than the first 78, so as a result, we are now deferring losses of about $21 million. And in percentage terms, now we're using a value of assets in this year's valuation, which is actually about 3% higher than the actual market value of assets. Now, we are fully confident in this method, but we don't want the board to lose sight of the fact that unless and until we actually build in the contribution, either the market recover and give us back the losses, or we build that into the employer's contribution rate stream through a high UAL. Otherwise, right now we have a deficit because the assets that we truly have to pay benefits to our retirees was only about 621. But for the valuation, we are using an assets value, which is $21 million higher than what was reflected in the market. Now, this was a dramatic change from 2021, because if we go back and look at the 21 valuations, because we were having such a great year, 2021, back then, the amount of market gains that we were sitting up on, when looking at the report from last year, the amount of gains that we have was 91 million. So in one short year, we changed from deferring gains of about 91 million to deferring loss of 21 million. Again, it can happen, and we've seen that happen. The market is very cyclical. Some years we earn more, some years we earn less. So if you ask Siegel, what do we expect the news to be? Assuming that we just close out the year earning just what Siegel you assume to be the assumed rate of return of 6.75, then next year, when Dirk and I present this valuation report to you as of June 30, 2023, we would expect going through and just recognizing 20% of the gains and losses, again, from 2022, and 20% of the gains from 2021, and so on, we would expect that on a net basis, we would be bringing up a loss which is slightly over $1 million. Okay, and the year following about 1 million, and then a gain of 3 million, followed by a huge loss of 22 million. So again, I don't want the board to be alarmed, but at least I want the board to be aware that because we're deferring the recognition of some of these losses, the way these assets, investment, deferred gains and losses will be recognized is such that next year and the following year, we are deferring and recognizing some of the losses, and then some gains the following year, and before we are hit with a huge loss. So something that I'm sure that the employer would be interested in at least finding out what does that mean that we are sitting on some deferred losses that we have not yet recognized. Now, I'm not going to go back to the front of the report because the front of the report also provides what the contribution rate requirement would be if we were to recognize the $21 million in this year's valuation. Again, this is just for informational purposes because definitely SECO is not recommending to the board that you recognize these deferred investment losses right away. Okay. So I think with that, we have already covered most of the important sections, I believe, in the front of the report dealing with the recommended employer contribution rate, how they reconcile in total from last year's valuation this year. Also, the recommended employee contribution rate. We have reconciled the UAAL. We look at what's the coming attraction, so to speak, how much of the deferred investment losses that are in the pipeline, unless the market returns back some of the losses that we have had. So I think with that, unless there are any other questions, I think I will turn it back to the chair and see if there are maybe any other questions from the board or from any of the audiences.
Thank you, Andy. We're open to comments or questions. Trustee Anderson.
Andy, I had a question for you, Bert. And you, in your summary, you talked about the plan maturing, being a mature plan. And we've been talking about that as a board. When I look at the member data, and it shows that on the members, that there's probably only 350 legacy members left employed. The new retirees are PEPR members. They make about half the retirement benefit that a legacy member makes. There's no COLA and so forth. And when I look at page 19 in particular, and this is tough to talk about these things, but I'm a retiree as well, is that when you look at the age distribution of legacy members, is it a reasonably fair assumption to say that without any changes in the mortality rates, that over the next 15 years, we'll see very few legacy members still in the system, and the system populated with PEPR members that, again, make half the retirement benefit with no COLA?
I think the short answer is yes. As a matter of fact, some of the board members may remember several months ago, right, we were in attendance at your offsite. And one of the things that we shared with the board back then was we know that we'll be welcoming more and more of our PEPR members who will be retiring. And as Jim, you mentioned, so to the extent that those members are not going to receive any COLA because there's no COLA available from the plan, I think we could easily be looking at least some requests, if not demands, by our members, from those members as to what we as a board would be able to do for them. So I don't want to predict what's going to happen, but the request that we made as Sonoma County SCARA Retirement Board could very easily be the kind of demands or requests that would be made from our members maybe 10, 15 or 20 years from now, because as Jim, as you mentioned, at that point in time, there will be fewer of the legacy members left. And I would not be surprised if the board would be staffed by members who would belong to the PEPR member ranks. And I think we would definitely be facing the same kind of questions that are asked today at Sonoma.
Thank you. Trustee Harris.
Mine was just a curiosity, but in the appendix, you said that when you look at our members, you assume that they are, if it doesn't say something else, you assume they're male, for one thing. And secondly, that you assume 70% of the males are married and only 50% of the women. I was wondering whether we've ever looked, find out what was really the case. Because I understand that safety is undoubtedly mostly male and probation, but when I walk through or in areas where we have our county employees, it seems as though most are probably women.
Yeah.
Am I? Yeah, I'd like to know how you came up with those assumptions.
Yeah,
Really look at it.
Right. So, good question, Trustee Harris. That's actually something we look at the time of the experience study. So, of course, in the experience study and in the valuation, we were provided with how many members are there in each of the three membership group: general, probation, and safety. So we actually take a look at how many of those members are male versus female. And I know that information is important because, for example, in setting member contribution rate, we know that we are not allowed to charge women more because to reflect that they live longer. So all members have to pay the same contribution rate. So in order to make sure that we collect enough for the members as a group to pay their fair share of the member contributions, we have to look into the percentage of members who are male and female. So likewise, we also look at members who are reported to us as retirees. How many of them are married, for example, with spouses of the same or the opposite sex? So all of that information was looked at the time of the last experience study, and definitely will be looked at again in the next experience study. And it is short answer is based on the membership demographic at MCL.
Good, thank you.
Yes, Trustee Judy.
Andy, on the chart you have on the screen, on the bar chart on the right, which is distribution of retired beneficiaries by age, it seems to show a higher percentage of the retirees who are on the younger side, 45 to let's say 64, a higher percentage are on disability retirement versus standard service retirement as a percentage of the group.
Right.
And it appears they almost aren't showing up on the chart age 85 and over in the last two bar charts or bar tables.
Right.
Do we have do we know if the percentage of employees who are collecting retirement on disability is going up over time as a percentage of the total that collect retirement? Or is it, not to be too morbid, but is it the people who've retired with the disability retirement are on average, have a shorter lifespan?
Now, first of all, in the valuation, we actually have an expectation that our disabled retirees are going to live, unfortunately, shorter lifespan. So the reason why I said that is in the valuation and as part of the actually triennial experience study, we last time anyway, we observed that disabled retirees are living shorter. So we use a so-called disabled life mortality table, which expects our disabled retirees, unfortunately, to live shorter life expectancy from our service retirees who are healthy at the time of retirement. So the assumptions that we've used in the valuation actually does reflect that our disabled retirees are living shorter lifetime compared to the service retirees. And I think that is not only true over at MCERA, but over at our other clients system as well, because we almost always recommend, and the board almost always adopt our recommendation of a shorter life expectancy for their disabled retirees as well.
So I understand what you're saying, that could be a national trend. I'm just curious if that in fact is true, or were a smaller percentage of employees who retired in years past retiring with a disability retirement. So I just didn't know if we had statistics. Is it a higher percent are today retiring with a disability retirement, or are those retiring with disability retirement for many decades now simply living shorter lives?
I see. Yeah, that unfortunately, I don't think we, Dirk can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think we have looked at the percentage of the members going out at the day of retirement. For example, in the class of 2020, 2, right? How many of them, what percentage of them are going out because of disability, and see whether or not that percentage of change over time. I know that at the back of the report, there's a so-called flow of life. So I think the information is available. We can always go back to the reports and be able to identify of any particular year of retirement, how many of the retirees are retiring because of disability, and see if that number has changed over time. Let me go to that page of the report. So we do have that information, but as you can see, at least for a system our size, right, we only have 3 that happened last year. So, but we have not gone in and utilized this information to see has that been a very steady number, or that been a number that jumps up and down over the years. So that information is available, but we have not used that information up to this point.
Trustee Harris and then Director Lynch.
To piggyback on Dan's question, we're all very much aware of the pressure put on safety members. And do you collect data that would show the number of disability retirements compared to the number of safety members? In other words, is the number of disability retirements in the safety category something that you collect, and is it increasing? Okay, I missed it there. Okay.
Yeah. We actually do. As a matter of fact, I won't go to that page of the report, but in the valuation, we have different assumptions that we apply to predict how often, at what age, and how many percent of our general, our safety, and our probation members actually retire at each age because of service retirement and disability retirement. So the way we get those information, we call that the decrements of the probability of retirement, disability retirement. So we got those out of our triennial experience study. So in other words, we don't do this every time at the day of the valuation to come up with not just the percentage of the members who go out because of disability, but in the experience study, we actually look at for each age, how many of our members, for example, let's use safety as an example. How many of our safety members at age 50 are retiring because of service retirement versus disability retirement? And and among the disability retirement for the safety, for example, we even go into take an extra step and find out of those disability retirement, because the level of benefit for service-connected disability and non-service connected disability is different. We actually also go in and look at service-connected disability versus non-service connected, so as to get as accurate as possible what the percentage would be. But of course, this is almost like a preview of the experience study, because we are not a big system. So even though in the experience study we try to use not just 3 years, sometimes 6, 9, and even 12 years of data, but as you can see, there's very little data for us to change that assumption. So what we do typically is look at the MSERA experience, and sometimes we have to look at some other outside experience to set the assumption. But the short answer is yes, we do look at the MSERA experience to inform us as to what recommendation we would make to the board insofar as predicting disability retirement.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. All right. Any other comments or questions? And there's lots of detailed charts at the back of that report. So I don't know what's in it.
Yeah. I missed it out.
So in the mortality valuation section, it says 5% increase in life and 5% reduction in males. That's a 10% difference. I couldn't catch in there anywhere what the actual day of the die is, or how old I'll be. But what are those numbers for this report? Life expectancy.
Now, I don't have that number at my fingertips, but I know that that's something that we have been putting into the experience study report. So if it is okay with you, Trustee Schumacher, I would like to maybe defer answering that question, but please ask me that question when we present to you the experience study report, because I know that that information has always been of interest to the board, and we'll be providing that information too.
Well, it used to be like 2 years. Now it seems like it's going to be an 8-year difference.
Yeah. And I think the question that, although we have been asked quite recently, right, because of the pandemic, hopefully it will soon be over, is how has the pandemic influenced the life expectancy for our retirees and for the populations also? Again, I won't try to answer the question today, but I'm sure that that question will come up, and we'll try to answer that question at that point in time.
We've talked about that. All right. Other comments or questions regarding the actuarial valuation study?
Madam Chair, we will need a motion to adopt the contribution rates in this report that we will then take to the Board of Supervisors for approval.
Okay, thank you for the reminder. I will entertain a motion to adopt.
Actually, if I may, through the chair, we should check and see if there's any public comment first.
Thank you, Jeff. Any public comment?
Doris is our attendee. There's
Doris,
no public comments at this time.
I don't have the rate on the top of my head. I think it's 1.45% more than last year, but I need a motion to adopt the current employer contribution.
It's employee and employer rates.
Oh, the line went down.
That
So it would be
They-
accept the evaluation report and adopt the employer and employee contribution rates as presented within the.
So moved.
Good, she's already.
Second, there we go, Judy, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Richard and Jerry. Any further discussion on the report or the contribution rates? Are you leaving this, Andy? That's
Oh,
the
no,
last-
I was just waiting to co-work.
Oh.
I'm sorry.
Okay, well, you can wait, that's all right. So we need a roll call vote to adopt this report and the contribution rate.
Ms. Covison,
Yes.
Ms. Cabinet,
Aye.
Mr. Jurdy,
Yes?
Ms. Smith,
Aye.
Mr. Cromer,
Aye.
Mr. Shoemaker, Ms. Harris,
Aye.
approved.
Thank you. And thank you, Andy, for that, and thank you, Dirk, for your moral support there.
Of course.
We will move on to item 4, which is now GASB or GAS 67 actuarial valuation. And Andy, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, actually, for this, Madam Chair, I will ask Dirk to walk us through quickly the GASB 67 report. I'll drive the report, so Dirk, please let me know which page you want me to go to.
Sure, of course. We'll start off on page 13. Perfect. So this is the accounting valuation for the plan. And just wanted to refamiliarize the board with some accounting terms. So the table up at the top provides on the left-hand side the June 30, 2022 valuation results. The top line is the total pension liability. That's very similar to the actuarial accrued liability that Andy had gone over in the funding valuation. There's a slight difference between the GASB and the funding valuation. Under the GASB rules, some employees work for dual memberships within MSERA. They might switch from general to safety, for instance. And under the GASB rules, the benefit formula that we use is the current benefit formula. And typically, an employee will move from a less rich plan to a richer plan benefit formula. So the liabilities here are slightly higher than the liabilities you'll see in the funding valuation report. So that's the top line. The second line, the plan's fiduciary net position, those are the plan assets. The difference is that under GASB, these are market value of assets as opposed to smooth value of assets in the funding valuation. And the third line is the net pension liability. This is like an unfunded liability number but again, on a market value basis. So you'll see that the net pension liability increased, almost doubled, more than doubled from 123 million last year to 250 million this year. The funded ratio went down from 84.9% to 71.3%. This is mostly driven by the return on the market value of assets for the year, which unfortunately, as Andy mentioned, was about negative 9.7% for the year. So that's mostly the driver of the less favorable position that we're seeing here. And then if we can move forward to
Dirk,
page,
can we
yes.
Stop there just a minute. I see trustee Jurdy has his hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. Dirk, you said that if an employee moved from basically the general membership plan, which is less rich than the two public safety plans, probation or general public safety, you would shift you'd increase the liability to the more expensive plan. Can you clarify if someone worked, just say theoretically 10 years in the general and then worked 5 years before retirement with a public safety plan, would they receive a retirement based on 10 years in general, 5 years in public safety, or would their entire 15 years be based on their public safety?
It's the entire 15 years based on the public safety. So as the footnote down at the bottom mentions that that the calculations are done on the accrual rate that is currently in place. We assume that that's always been in effect. The liabilities.
Is that a?
If I may make a comment, and I apologize. When we calculate their retirement benefit when they physically retire, it will be using the two formulas, 10 years at the general formula, 5 years at the safety. This report, GAS 67, is solely for calculating the liability that the employers show on their financial statements, and that projects or calculates the total value of the liability based on the formula of the membership group that the member is in at the time of this GAS report, but it does not affect how we actually calculate their benefits when they retire.
That is correct.
All right. Thank you for the clarification.
And just to give some magnitude of numbers, we have $871.9 million of liability here, and in the funding report, it's about 871.5, I believe it was. So there's not that much of a difference.
Right. Yeah. As a matter of fact, I think Dirk, we used to have the same number for both plans, but we know that if we have to follow the accounting rules to the T, so which of course we do. That's why we introduce a slight discrepancy, and as Doris has indicated, members are not going to get any more benefit because the accountant said you have to report the liability this way. So this is really just a matter of presentation, taking the difference of the liability and splitting that between what is in the past called the pension liability versus what's accruing the normal cost. So a very technical jargon. So it's just a matter of allocating that same added benefit between the past and the future. That's all.
Thank you.
Okay. So if there are no more questions, we'll go to page 16, please. So this table just shows how we got from last year's position to this year's position. The top part of the table is the total pension liability. Again, basically the kind of like actuarial accrued liability. It shows how the pieces that we got from last year's starting point to this year's. The middle section is some kind of information on planned fiduciary net position or market value of assets, how we got from last year's position to this year's position. And down at the bottom is another required reporting number to express the net pension liability or the unfunded liability as a percentage of the actual covered payroll, the 81 million. So that came in at 305% of payroll this year compared to 160% of last year. Again, mostly driven by the doubling of the net pension liability. If I can have you move back one page, Andy, to 15, please. One other reporting requirement is sensitivity on the discount rate. So currently, MCR uses a 6.75% discount rate. And as we had noted, the unfunded or net pension liability under that assumption is the 250 million. They asked for a sensitivity if you increase the discount rate by 1%, which is off to the right, or decrease it by 1%, which is off to the left. And that just shows the effect on the net pension liability if you move the discount rate up or down. I guess the final page that'll take you through is page 20. So this is a kind of roll forward of the cash flow and the assets, the benefit payments, contributions based on the current set of employees as of June 30, 2022. It's basically illustrating that if you discount everything at your assumed rate of 6.75%, you'll have enough assets to pay the benefits until the last retiree is no longer with us. So that's just an illustration of projecting everything out based on the current population as of June 30, 2022. That's basically the information we have in this report. I don't know if there are any other questions or if Andy has anything to add.
Yeah, I know that this is a report that is required for the plans financial reporting. Now later on, of course, the employer will have some different needs, so we will need to provide to them the so-called pension expense and an allocation of the net pension liability by employer. So that report is called GASP 68. There's a companion report, but that would usually not be available until the early part of next quarter because the employer actually does not need that information until they prepare the financial statements as of June 30, 2023. But that's really a report coming up that we'll be providing to the board in the early part of next year.
Is this GAS 67 and 68, are those new, brand new?
Yeah, they have been around for several years now, yes. Yeah.
And what happened to the B on gas?
They just started calling it gas instead of Gatsby. I don't know why.
That's not weird.
Yeah.
Because I guess it's the actual standard, and the B stands for the board, so.
Yeah. I have to admit that some clients would like the term gas, GAS. Sometimes clients would say GSB. Other clients would say gas. How about GASBS, right? GASB statement 67. So I think we have been following the convention, but definitely open to suggestions and requests to make a change if it is more intuitive.
No
These are
problem.
for accounting types, like.
I know, that's why this is the B. Always remember. Yeah. Well, I appreciate the work that you guys do. Are there any questions or any public comment on this report?
There does not appear to be any.
Well, Andy and Dirk, thank you for presenting today and preparing the reports for us. And I guess we will see you in the spring.
Okay, great. Thank you so
Sounds
much.
good. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. And I think we need a 10-minute break. No, it was just a presentation. That's
That's just like a receipt.
receiving line. So why don't we take a break? I've got 9:54. How about we take a break until 10:05? Okay.
Yeah, right. All right, I think I've worked.
Number 5, discussion and possible action regarding investment matters. And we have our investment experts from Callan here, so I will turn it over to Gred. What your sign says, Gred DeForest.
Is that from me? Did I do that?
Yeah.
That's what it says.
Oh, my goodness. Oh, well, I need to fix that.
Is
Oh,
that your bowling name?
maybe that was the D, Greg D. My middle name's Fitzpatrick. It can't be that. So it's great seeing you all today. Wish we could be there in person. Today's my son's 15th birthday, so I stayed at home a little bit and we celebrated. Had ice cream cake first thing in the morning. That's the way to start after Halloween. But thanks for letting us dial in remotely this morning. We have 2 agenda items for you today. The first is to go over one item is to go over the quarterly performance report. And as we'll get into, it's been a very, very difficult place to be an investor for the past, really, it's going on 12 months now, since November of last year. So we'll talk about the performance. But before we get into that, we're going to spend some time with Gary Chang to talk about the asset liability study process. So today we're not talking about results. We're not talking about any recommendations, but rather the process we're going to go through for asset liability study for you in the coming months. So this is more of a description of what we're going to be doing, not a recommendation at this time. So what we thought we'd do is start off with Gary at first, have him walk through the presentation, and then after Gary concludes, we'll hop into first quarter performance. Does that sound good to everyone?
Sounds good. Thanks, Greg.
Okay, great. Thank you. And with that, I think Hannah might share her screen, and Gary's gonna take it away.
Great. Can everybody hear me okay?
I think so, yes.
Okay, how about now? Is it a little bit better?
Much better, Gary.
Okay, great. So maybe Hannah, if you could flip to page 3. One more. Yeah. So as Greg mentioned, today is really more of an introduction to the project. And so this presentation is going to answer the question of why we're doing an asset liability study and what that process is going to be like. Actually, Hannah, do you mind going back one page, please? Thank you. So the goal of the asset liability study is to choose an asset allocation, right? And that asset allocation decision really depends on what your objectives are. And that's expressed as a return target, right? So the higher return you're aiming for over the long term, that should translate to less contributions for the county, or in other words, less cost of running the pension plan. But the flip side of that, obviously, is if you take more risk in pursuit of that higher return, that's going to translate to more volatility, right, year to year, because investments could suffer some losses, and that needs to be made up by contributions. So the asset allocation decision is really, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, because it's influenced by many factors that are specific to you all, and that may be different from other plans. And those factors you can see are listed on the right-hand side of the page here. And we'll take into account all of these different factors when we do this asset liability study for you all. I won't go through all of these factors, but maybe just point out a couple of these as an example. When we look at time horizon, for example, the 4th bullet point there, that's one of the very important factors, right? So your plan is open to new employees and accruing benefits still. So that means that the time horizon is still very long, and all else equal, that typically means you're able to take on a little bit more investment risk because that time horizon is long. Compare that to a pension plan that may have a shorter time horizon where they're not accruing any benefits. That's going to have an impact on the asset allocation decision, whether you can go into more illiquid investments, for example. So maybe moving on to the next page. So where does asset allocation fit in, and how does it interact with the funding policy and the benefits policy that Siegel and Andy talked to you guys about today? So you can kind of see a schematic here on this page. It's a little bit busy, but the top part of this page basically lists out the information and details about your plan. But the main takeaway is the box at the bottom, right, which puts into context the role of asset allocation. So looking at the right-hand side of this formula, you can see that the benefits paid out of the plan, it must either come from contributions or investment earnings, right? So as we go through this project, we'll model out all of these policies, what your benefits are, what your contribution policy is, and we'll see how the different asset allocations that we'll show you impact the interaction of all these three policies. So maybe going on to the next page 5. So let's talk a little bit about the modeling. How are we going to model your benefit policy, your contribution policy, and investment policy? So as we heard from Siegel today, you just finished up your 2022 valuation, and we will request all of the underlying data and assumptions that Siegel used for the valuation, and that's the basis of our liability model, which is shown at the top right-hand part of the page here. And then along with those, that information, we'll use our 2023 capital market assumptions. Now we're looking at the top left-hand of the page here, and use Callan's assumptions for asset class return and risk. And we'll be able to combine both the asset side and the liability side from Siegel and simulate out into the future what the financial position of the pension fund is over many types of scenarios, right? Normal market environments as well as poor market environments. And, we heard about the COLA questions today, so we will also simulate high inflation scenarios as well as sort of baseline expected inflation scenarios to see the impact of the fund as well. The idea is not to only see how the different asset allocations impact the pension fund's financials over sort of normal markets, but how do different asset allocations perform over poor market environments, and to be able to quantify the risk and reward trade-off, right? As we heard earlier, this is really a risk and reward trade-off. The more risk you take on average should be rewarded, but in a downside event, you could could end up losing more, right? So what is that trade-off, and what kind of level of risk is acceptable to you all? So these are the types of questions that we will hopefully answer in this study. So that covers sort of the reasons and the process around doing the project. And next, we'll go over details on recurrent asset allocation and capital market assumptions. So let's flip to page 7. So here's a very high-level look at your current portfolio. In very broad terms, the retirement plan has 62% allocation to public equity, 21% to core fixed income, and 17% to private real assets. And so when we apply our 2023 capital market assumptions, that gives an expected return of 6.8%. And just as a side note, we are finalizing these assumptions, the 2023 assumptions, so these numbers may change slightly when we present the final study next year. But it is interesting to point out that your current discount rate of 6.75 is very close to our expected return of 6.8%. We'll go over in a bit as to the underlying assumptions. How do we get to that 6.8% in a moment? And we'll look at each of the building blocks, right? Each of the asset class returns and risks. But before we do that, maybe just covering the right-hand side of the page here. This is a summary of your financial position at the end of June 2022 this year. And so we put these estimates together before the actuarial valuation was finalized. So you can see that actuarial accrued liability estimate there of $850 million is actually a little bit higher from the actual report. It's about $22 million higher. And as we heard from Andy and Siegel, that's mainly due to the COLA increase impact, right, about $12 million, and a salary increase impact about $10 million. So that's that difference there. It should be a little bit higher. And so the market funded status is roughly 70% at the end of June. So flipping on to the next page. This is a detailed a page here showing expected return and risk numbers for each of the asset classes. So you can see we've laid out all the asset classes that you're currently invested in, which is shown in the green shaded rows. And the projected return and the projected risk of each of these asset classes is shown in the right two columns there. So just a couple highlights here. Equities, which is at the top of the table, you can see is expected to return just slightly above 7%. And then looking at fixed income in the middle of the table is expected to return just under 4%. And just as a side note, the fixed income number here is a little bit higher than it's been in recent years. Given where interest rates have moved this year, yields are higher, so we expect fixed income to actually return a little bit around 4% this year. And then finally, real estate and infrastructure. These returns are somewhere between bonds and equities at between 6 and 6.5%. So when you take all of these returns together and apply that to your current portfolio, that gets us to 6.8%. And then one final note on this page here, we've highlighted an asset class which we think you can potentially consider as a part of this study, which is shown in the orange, which is private equity. And there are a couple reasons we think you could consider this asset class. Number one is you can see it has the highest expected returns, right, at 8.5%, which is even higher than public equities. But that does come with a higher risk as well. You can see the standard deviation projected risk is the highest at 27.6%. But the advantage is it's another engine for growth. You're not relying only on public equities for the higher returns. And the second reason we think you can consider it is efficiency, right? Efficiency through diversification. It's not only expected to have high returns, but it helps diversify your existing asset classes in your portfolio. But it may not be suitable for everyone, so there are a couple things that we need to consider when it comes to private equity. It does come with higher expected risk. It comes with more complexity, more illiquidity, and higher fees. So I'll maybe pause here for a moment to see if there's any questions, but I think that kind of covers our prepared remarks we have today. There's more information downstream, but I'll pause here.
Thanks, Gary. Trustee Jurdy.
Yeah. So Gary, it seems to me that there could be a role for private equity for MSERA, but my concerns that I have is because it's less liquid. When MSERA does need to call on funds to make payments to beneficiaries, then we're reliant on the liquid funds and maybe not giving them time to produce the yields that we're expecting. So, just an example, if we had 10% of our funds in private equity, and then now we've shrunk our portfolio down to 90%, that's accessible in times when we need to make payments, which is every single month, to retirees. And so then the other funds, let's say the public equities, could be down in that month, but we have to call on it. And so we're not getting the full benefit of letting those funds in public equities grow over time because we're constantly calling on them. So that's one concern. And the other is just in a conversation I had with someone, and I know this is purely anecdotal, but who is in the private equity space, that with rising interest rates, that they typically will purchase a smaller company partly with cash from investors, but then partly borrowed funds. And as interest rates, the cost of borrowing goes up, they're needing to pay less for those companies they're purchasing because they're spending more money to secure the cash to make the purchase. And so there's, it's going to lead into acquisition of companies at a lower price and or with a lower rate of return. So those are just two concerns that I have off the top. And so I'm a reluctant, I'm a skeptic of MSERA going into private equity.
And I think those are 100% accurate points, Dan. And on top of that, there are additional reporting requirements that you have if you go into private equity too. And we did the educational session and we talked about a few categories. This was the one that was a maybe. And so what we're going to do in the study that Gary conducts is we're going to model with and without private equity. And we can also follow up with additional education on private equity if there's interest. But when we model with and without, at that point, we could say, let's just forget it, or, oh, let's look into it a little bit more. So we're going to model both options. And this is not necessarily saying we're definitely going to recommend private equity.
Trustee Harris.
Maybe it was
Yeah, maybe-
in our ancient history, but I thought as a board, we decided we're not interested in private equity, primarily because we already have a portfolio that is high risk, much more so than many others in the institutional investor space. And it seems like we keep getting pounded on the head about private equity. And, it was, Greg, you undoubtedly remember, but it was a couple of years ago that we voted we're not going to go into this space. But maybe Phyllis is a big mistake, and I love looking at 27%. Remember,
That's the risk. We don't want that.
oh, yeah, 8.5%, excuse me. Yeah, you'll have to pardon me. I would have not been here. Anyway, it just keeps coming back, and that's probably because you think we really need to investigate this space. I'm fine. We've got a much different board. We did vote not to go into
Yeah,
it.
So, the way I would describe this is we did the educational session, maybe it was 2 meetings ago. And this was the one category after we talked about a few that if we add something, it would be this. And the last time we did this study, we said if we add anything, we would add infrastructure. And so if we add anything, it'd be private equity, but we certainly don't need to. And if there's, we're not pounding the table that you got to do it, but we're just having our, both options on the table at this point. And that's a follow up from the meeting we had a couple months ago.
Trustee Cromer. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Greg, I just had a quick question. When you do the modeling, and if you add an allocation to private equity, you're adjusting other areas of the portfolio to keep the overall risk still around the 13%. Are you modeling any portfolios that might have an overall level of risk that's lower than the 13%? Because if I'm not mistaken, that's relatively on the high end for sterile systems.
I think page 13 answers that question, actually. If Hannah, you could flip there, please. So you're exactly right. We will model both portfolios that have a higher amount of return, but the same level of risk. So your portfolio right now, let me actually back up a moment and explain this chart. So this is an efficient frontier. We have expected risk of the portfolio on the horizontal axis here. So when we move from left to right, we're increasing the amount of risk in your portfolio. And the vertical axis is how much return you're expected to generate, right? So going from the bottom to the top, you're increasing your return. So your current portfolio is shown in that orange dot right there, labeled MSERA, and you can see that's around 13% risk for about 6.8% return, right? And when you add private equity, you are shifting around the allocation. So your fixed income might increase, right? When you add private equity, and your public equities would decrease. And so you could see you can maintain the same level of return and move just to the left there to a portfolio 3P, which reduces the amount of risk but keeps that same return there. So as I alluded to, that's the diversification impact, right? By including private equity, you could adjust the other asset classes and have a better diversified portfolio, more diversified portfolio that could keep the same level of return at a lower risk. And I think the risk right there that's shown in 3P is about close to 1% lower risk.
unlike the other trustees, it's always nice to hear about an asset class. But in addition to benefit payments, recently we ran into some issues with rebalancing to the targets, especially in the fixed income, where that's been a low return and we've been rebalancing out of our more liquid assets. I would hope that any scenario would look at our historical kind of pretty regular dependence on the equities to rebalance fixed income.
Yeah, we'll certainly look at that, and what they call the denominator effect is in full force right now, where the public market assets are being marked down and the private market assets aren't yet. They will, but they're not there yet. So you get a accounting valuation that shows that you're overweight these private market assets whose valuation is lagged, and they will catch up over time. So we'll look at that for sure. And then we'll also look at the rebalancing ranges as well. I think that's something that in this study we could also take a look at to say, if we change the amount of illiquid assets, should our bands be a little wider to make sure we don't inadvertently trip a guideline or force a liquidation when we don't want to do that?
So on the chart on page 13, what is the percent of allocation that is made this chart? If private equity is what percent of our allocation, reading the lines up there.
So this chart assumes that it's around 5 to 6% private equity.
If the board wants to give us direction at this point to not even model private equity, we can go ahead and model without. But based on at least my interpretation of the discussion a couple months ago, I thought the guidance we had was to model with and without. But we could definitely change that.
At the offsite, Greg, just to confirm your recollection that one of the items was to explore alternative asset classes, including private equity and or private credit, if I'm not mistaken, as part of the strategic plan discussion that you helped us partake in. So that was one of the outcomes. So I think it would make sense to continue to have some educational sessions on those alternative asset classes. Whether or not the board wishes you to model them in the asset liability study, I'll leave to the board. But you are correct in your recollection that there was discussion about private equity.
Okay, great.
Yeah, Greg, as far as my preference, I love to hear about any investment opportunities in different asset classes, especially when other retirement systems do invest in those, just to see and compare. My concern in doing that is I would very much want to focus on the reporting requirement for our staff, because staff time is very
for sure
precious right now. And if it involves that much more work for our people and a very high management cost for us to invest in that field, I would really want to focus on that.
So it's such a broad category, and personally, with private equity into multifamily housing, and say something in there is a 5% in California. But I don't know how in the weeds you can get with your allocation and how you would put it in.
So I think next month we're going to come up and talk to you about real estate. And one of the topics we're going to talk about is what we're seeing some other investors do in terms of investing in within California.
So, but there's construction lending, ownership lending, and ownership is 3 categories. And I thought, wouldn't this fit more in construction lending and mortgage type lending?
Yeah, and this is a sort of asset category that kind of sits between 2 buckets. I would stick that in the real estate bucket. But to your point, you're also lending directly to people who might build. It's a company you're lending to, not so much real estate. But we could think about that in the real estate bucket, independent of private equity as well.
On the previous chart, you did have a investment manager, a name listed there. Can you tell us anything about that particular? Not that one, the one you had with the orange line. That one.
Oh, Cambridge Private Equity. That is that's an index. It's kind of like saying the S&P 500.
Okay, any further questions, comments about private equity? Does the board want to pursue looking at these two scenarios when they do their asset liability study?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm very interested in it.
I have no objections,
Yeah, in a fund type of situation.
but I do agree with Quincy's comments about workload.
I believe we did pursue this for a period of time when we chose to invest in infrastructure. That's my recollection when I was on the board. And it was the fees and the reporting and staff time that I think led us away on top of the volatility of that investment. That's my recollection. It's been a few years now.
Yeah, but our strategic plan does say continue to investigate all alternatives. Okay, we can move on. Gary, you have more on this report?
Nothing for me.
I'm sorry, Gary, I missed that.
Well,
Oh, I
maybe,
had nothing.
maybe Gary will just close out on slide 16. I think it's 16, but about next steps and just level set in that regard.
Right. So now that the actuarial evaluation is complete from Siegel, we will be requesting the underlying data and assumptions from Siegel, and that will happen fairly soon here. And then we'll take that information and then model that as well as our 2023 capital market assumptions and do the analysis and be able to put together the presentation and the analysis and be able to present that in the first quarter of 2023. So that's the project timeline.
Okay. Comments, questions? Thank you for that, Gary. You probably weren't expecting that pushback on private equity, but you know where the board stands at the moment. So
Yep.
We will move on then to the quarterly investment report.
I think Hannah might be pulling it up. I have it up too, Hannah. You got it? Okay. All right. So it's been a volatile market and very difficult market, to say the least, on a year-to-date basis. And as I said earlier, really started in November. And in November of last year, we started to see an increase in interest rates. And all assets repriced because the discount rate was going up. And that's the world that we lived through for the first 4, 5, 6 months. And now we're shifting towards, will we have a recession? And what will the impact of a recession be on the price of stocks and fixed income? The Federal Reserve has increased interest rates faster than we've seen in decades. And that's caused the price of bonds to go down more than we've seen in the history of the Barclays aggregate index. On a year-to-date basis, we're looking at a negative 15, 16% return, depending on what day you look at it. And we've never had an environment like that before. Now, part of the reason we have such a meaningfully negative return, interest rates going up, but also the starting yield was so low. So there wasn't a lot of cushion for us to absorb an increase in interest rates. The silver lining in the clouds right now is that valuations are a lot more reasonable in both the stock and the bond market. And if we avoid a deep recession, or if we avoid stagflation, we should be in a much better earning position going forward in an absolute return sense and in a real return sense relative to inflation. Today's a big day. It's a Fed day. So in about 23 minutes, they're going to announce whether or not interest rates go up 75 basis points or anything different. That's pretty much locked in. Everyone expects the 75 basis points. We won't have a new dot plot today, which is informative for us to set up expectations. So everyone's going to be hanging on the words in the announcement and hanging on the press conference with Chairman Powell in about an hour to see if they can, if you can glean anything, just a few words here or there about what the future path will be for interest rates. Most market participants right now expect the Fed funds rate to cap at 4.75% to 5.25% about 5 to 6 months from now, and then to let it sit there for a year, experience a mild recession, and have inflation come down. That's currently what most market participants expect. And that's an expectation you can assign a probability to. But we have other probabilities as well of, well, what if inflation is not controlled and they have to go higher? That's bad for both stocks and bonds. What if inflation comes down by itself? We're cutting interest rates sometime next year. So there's certainly probabilities on all sides of it. So let's see what happens in about 20 minutes or so. On slide 3, here we're showing the capital market returns through the end of September. And as I mentioned, there's really no place to hide. Both stocks and bonds in the United States down 4 to 5%. International stocks down more. And the only positive areas were real estate. It's great we have that diversifying asset. And then hedge funds actually eked out a slightly positive return here for the quarter as well. Notably, inflation started to roll over just a little bit in the quarter, but certainly not enough where year over year, especially inflation, certainly not enough where it gives the Fed cover to stop increasing interest rates. Now, the year-to-date time period that we're showing here, the returns are pretty bleak. But one thing I think it's worth pointing out is if you look at returns over a 2-year time period, we're still in positive territory. So we know the year-to-date time period's been really painful, but we got to remember 1 year ago, we were sitting on very large gains on a year-to-date basis. So an investment program like yours that has a very long time horizon, we're actually not doing that bad over a 3-year time period, let's call it. That doesn't mean that year-to-date's not painful. But over a longer time period, what we're really trying to achieve, there has been a premium of being an investor. On the next slide, we have a whole bunch of numbers about capital markets. I mentioned that there's some numbers here that show inflation rolling over just a little bit in the upper right-hand corner. On the upper left-hand corner, we had slightly negative GDP for 2 quarters. We posted a reasonable number around 2% in the most recent quarter. And what that means is that the economy continues to grow because most individuals are still doing pretty well financially, and most corporations are doing pretty well financially right now as well. So the pain is yet to hit in those 2 main categories yet. So GDP continues to grow around 2%. Interest rates on the bottom left have increased meaningfully, and it's the fastest increase that we've seen. if you look at break-even inflation rate on the right-hand corner here, that's the yellow line. What this line is telling us is that the market thinks over 10 years that inflation is going to average about 2.5%. So the market right now says the Fed will get the job done and will conquer inflation. The market could be wrong, but that's currently what's priced into the market. I'm going to flip ahead to 6, if you don't mind, Hannah. Over the last few years, a lot of investors have bought on the dip, right? We have generations of investors who just, anytime the market goes down, you buy. And it works. And that's worked for, since the global financial crisis, 2000 and 2008. But what we should keep in mind is that if you look at the last couple drawdowns, they are longer and they're deeper than most people expect. Right? The dark yellow line here, that was the COVID drawdown. That was a really unique situation. And the Fed came over the hill and saved everyone, right? By pumping a lot of money into the market. And there were stimulus checks that meaningfully went out from the Fed. From the government. But most other drawdowns last over a year. And they go down longer than most people think. So I think that's important to point out, that if history rhymes, then we still got a ways to go. We've still got a ways to go if history rhymes. With that, how about we just flip ahead and start talking about your portfolio, and Claire's going to run through that, and we'll start off on slide 16. Hannah, thank you.
Thanks, Hannah. So this chart, or these charts on page 16 really capture well, I think, what all of the market volatility that Greg described has meant for the MSERA portfolio. And if you look at the chart on the top, we look at the total market value for the portfolio over the last 15 years. And on the far right, we see what the effect of this recent market pullback that we've seen year to date in 2022 has meant for that total market value. So overall, assets as of the end of the third quarter are almost back in line with where we were about 2 years ago. As Greg mentioned, a little bit ahead of where we were 2 years ago. So still ahead of where we were pre-pandemic, before we saw that sharp drawdown at the beginning of 2020, still ahead of there. But we have certainly retraced some of the gains that we saw in 2021 in particular. So we're about $100 million short of where we were at that ultimate peak at the end of 2021. At the bottom, we look at how assets have changed in the plan in just the last quarter. So as Greg mentioned, we've certainly seen some pretty sharply negative absolute returns. At the beginning of the quarter, so the end of June 30th, the portfolio stood at about $622 million in total assets. Those negative investment returns translated to about $34.5 million in losses, investment losses in the quarter. And here we show about $9 million flowing out of the portfolio in the quarter. That's a little bit nuanced. It is a kind of a point in time nuance in that, if you'll remember, at the end of last quarter, the portfolio was rebalanced. And there were a couple trades associated with that rebalance that settled at the beginning of July 1st. So trades that were executed at the end of June settled at the beginning of July that are getting captured there. So if you look at the 2 quarters together, that gives a better sense of kind of net outflows for benefits and expenses versus just capturing that rebalance. But then you put all that together, and the portfolio ended the quarter at about $578.5 million in total assets. So again, ahead of where we were pre-pandemic, but certainly a lower number than we were looking at the beginning of the calendar year. On page 17, we look at the actual asset allocation of the portfolio. So among the different asset categories that you invest in as a total portfolio versus the strategic target. So Gary talked a bit about this, the allocation to public equity versus private assets, and how your actual asset allocation looked at the end of September versus that target has a couple nuances. So one being that the domestic real estate allocation stood at about 16% of the total portfolio versus the target of about 11%. So you're overweight real estate. And that was true at the end of last quarter too. One thing that struck me as we were discussing private equity earlier is that a complexity of adding private equity or any alternative asset category to the portfolio, a non-public market, is liquidity. And so for your real estate allocation, you can't just pull market out or assets out and rebalance that like you can the public equity side of the portfolio. So you continue to run a little bit higher on real estate. That hasn't been a bad thing for portfolio returns in the last couple quarters, as real estate and infrastructure together have been the two highest performing asset categories in the portfolio. So we're watching that. You are overweight real estate. The other thing to note from an asset allocation perspective is that international equity was underweight versus target as of the end of the quarter, 22% versus about 25%. Robert has been working to rebalance the public equity portion of the portfolio to get that back in line, because that does that underweight of about 3% did trip the rebalancing band as specified in your investment policy statement. So that's some activity that's going on subsequent to this snapshot as of the end of September. Page 18 shows a chart that Gary included in his presentation as well, but this looks at the actual asset allocation versus target. So same information we were looking at on the previous slide, but over the last 5 years, how has this changed over time? And as you know, as kind of good reminder as we head into the next asset liability study, at the conclusion of the last study we did a few years ago, the decision was to add infrastructure, and that's the key change that you see showing up in this chart here. So that yellow allocation representing the funding of that infrastructure allocation, which has happened in the last year and a half. I'll skip ahead 2 slides to slide 20, which looks at the detailed asset allocation of the portfolio as of the end of the quarter among all of the different investment managers with whom you implement the portfolio and the different asset categories. So the bottom line shows the same information we saw on the first slide. Portfolio started with about $622 million in total assets. Saw pretty significant investment losses during the quarter to the tune of about $34.5 million. Some outflows during the quarter to pay benefits and also take into account that rebalancing activity, and ended the quarter with $578 million in total assets. The other thing that I check when I look at this page is how the different implementation of the asset managers within each asset category stood at the end of the quarter. Are they still in balance with expectations based on your intentions for implementation? And broadly, the answer to that is yes. If you look a bit more nuanced, there is slight, within international equity, you have slight underweight to emerging markets and your value managers. That's something that Robert was working to address in the recent rebalancing activity. The other thing that I noted, you were slightly overweight to your mid-cap managers within domestic equity. That's also something that was taken into account in that rebalancing activity. But overall, things do remain broadly in line with expectations. When you look at fixed income, infrastructure, and real estate, pretty even allocations between the managers within those asset categories. Performance for the total portfolio is captured on page 21. And here we see that the total fund was down about 6.7% for the recent quarter. That compared to a target return of -5% for the quarter. That return landed pretty much at the bottom of the peer group distribution, but that peer group distribution was pretty narrow in the recent quarter. If you look at the last year, there was a much broader distribution of returns among public fund peers. And the MThera portfolio landed right about in the middle of that distribution. So down about 14.7% for the last year versus a negative 12.9% return for the benchmark. As Greg mentioned, all longer time periods remain solidly in positive territory and really at the top of the peer group distribution that we look at here. So as a reminder, we'll see, or actually let's just flip ahead one slide, page 22, to look at those fiscal year returns and how those factor into the cumulative returns we just saw. Fiscal year 2022 was down about 9.7%, and we started the next fiscal year off with a negative quarter. But the previous fiscal year, 2021, we were coming off a 32% return for the total portfolio. So putting those two returns together, again, all falls in line with that first chart we saw of total market value and how we saw assets go pretty sharply up and where those assets have retraced in the recent year and recent quarter. And I'll flip ahead a few slides to slide 25, where we look at the relationship of risk and return for the total portfolio and the total portfolio target. The chart on the left shows plots the return versus the standard deviation of the total fund and the total fund target over the last 15 years. And this is a chart that we've looked at on a regular basis at our quarterly meetings, which shows that the total portfolio has achieved a return broadly in line with the target over the last 15 years, but with a higher level of volatility. And that volatility has actually landed kind of at the top range of the peer group, which is represented by the ellipse here. That's something that we've talked about in meetings time and time again. Higher allocation to public equity drives a higher volatility over time, but it has over time paid off for your portfolio. There was a question at the last meeting about how that's changed since you all implemented the new allocation to infrastructure following the last asset liability study. And it took a bit of time to get that capital called. So the infrastructure allocation has been in the portfolio now for about a year and a half. So this is a short time period, we recognize that. But the right-hand chart shows that same information over that shorter time period since you implemented the infrastructure allocation. And the key change is what we would have expected, and I think what was a key goal of adding that, which is that the standard deviation or the risk, the volatility of the portfolio has come closer to the median of your peer group. So short time period, but we thought that was worth looking at given the discussion at the last quarterly meeting, and something we'll keep an eye on as the infrastructure allocation continues to be part of the portfolio over a longer time period. Page 26 takes a look at attribution, so what's contributed and detracted to returns for the total portfolio versus the target, just on the recent time periods, so the shorter time periods of the last quarter and year, where we have seen these sharp negative returns. And there's a couple things that stand out to me here. So one, the international equity managers have been the most challenged portion of the portfolio in this shorter time period. Your active managers have underperformed their benchmarks in the last quarter and year. So that's been one source of underperformance. The other one is real estate and infrastructure. And I think those are worth pointing out because they are a bit nuanced. So your infrastructure allocation is benchmarked to the same benchmark as your real estate allocation, the Odyssey. It's not a perfect benchmark, and we are seeing a bit of a mismatch there, kind of on the shorter time period return comparison. We think it's reasonable comparison over longer time periods, but that underperformance versus the quote unquote benchmark for infrastructure, I think is worth pointing out because your infrastructure managers are really doing quite well. They did turn in a positive return for the quarter and the year. So adding to the portfolio the way that you would, the way that they were intended to be, and doing well versus other infrastructure allocation portfolios. The real estate portion, your two real estate managers, as we'll see, did underperform the Odyssey benchmark in the recent quarter and year, and that's dragging down attribution a bit over these shorter time periods. We've seen a pretty considerably wide dispersion of returns within real estate in these recent time periods as appraisals are starting to come in. So that's sort of a lumpy process. And when there's few transactions in a given market, it takes a while to see kind of consistency around those revaluations, especially as we're seeing repricing on the downside within real estate. So we don't have any concerns with your real estate managers, but I did want to point out in these shorter time periods that has shown up here as a negative contribution from an attribution perspective versus that benchmark. But again, no concerns at this point. And we think actually other managers are probably going to catch up to that as we see more appraisals and revaluations coming in on real estate. And then the last couple pages here, starting on page 27, finishing on page 28, look at detailed returns for each of your investment managers over both near-term and longer-term time periods. Page 27 captures returns for your domestic equity managers. In the last quarter, just about every manager underperformed their benchmark. That said, over the last year, where we've also seen pretty significant negative returns, almost every manager protected value for you on the downside. So it was a negative quarter, a challenging quarter for your active managers to outperform just in this last quarter. Over the longer one-year time period where we've seen significant volatility, we're actually quite pleased with the protection that your investment managers have offered in that negative market environment. Over longer time periods, your managers have delivered. We do feel comfortable with the performance that all of your managers have turned in as it is generally consistent with our expectations for each strategy. No concerns in terms of your portfolio managers staying true to their styles and the strategies with which for which you hired them. Page 28 looks at performance for the international equity managers, the domestic fixed income managers, infrastructure, and real estate. So basically everything outside of domestic equity. As I mentioned, it's been a really challenging time period for your international equity managers. So we had seen pretty strong positive outperformance as of last year. We were pleased to see many of your active managers outperforming in a strong up market. We've seen a reversal of that in the recent time period. So down about 12% in aggregate versus a negative 10% for the MSCI ACWI ex-US index. As a reminder, you do have a dedicated small cap allocation with T. Rowe Price. That is an out of benchmark allocation, so it does make your portfolio different than that ACWI ex-US index. And over long time periods, having that out of benchmark allocation has really been additive to the portfolio. So if you look at the last 3 and 5 year time periods, having dedicated small cap has generated a positive return even when the total international equity portfolio has been negative. So longer term, that's been a positive strategic allocation. In the recent quarter and year, it's been a bit of a headwind. So particularly in the last year, having the dedicated small cap allocation has been a headwind to relative performance for the total international equity. Within domestic fixed income, Dodge & Cox and PIMCO are your two active managers. No concerns with their performance. Again, it has been a really challenging negative market for bond managers overall, but your two managers together continue to navigate that as we would expect. Over longer time periods, the two together have turned in outperformance for any time period or for any time period longer than 1 year. And even in the last year, they've actually performed right in line with that benchmark. And then infrastructure and real estate, the last two asset categories here at the bottom, you do see positive returns for each over the last year. Both Greg and Gary mentioned the benefit of the diversification that having those allocations has offered to the portfolio. That's been particularly true in the last year. Only one of your infrastructure managers had reported returns at the time of the publishing of this report. That's IFM. It was positive at about 42 basis points for the quarter. We're still waiting on JP Morgan's numbers, which we would expect would actually benefit returns once we get those finalized numbers in. And then real estate, in aggregate, your manager's down about 2% for the quarter. That was behind the benchmark, as I mentioned, when we looked at attribution, but we don't have any key concerns. A key driver of negative returns in the recent quarter has been allocations to office. Some of the office properties that Barings in particular held did come in with new appraisals, did come in with write-downs for, I believe it was 3 of the 4 office properties in the portfolio. And that's a trend that we expect to continue to see out of other managers as those appraisals get updated going forward. Still in the last year, the real estate portfolio in aggregate contributed over 18% in positive returns. Certainly a benefit of diversification to the portfolio with negative returns out of fixed income and equity during that time period. I'll pause there for any questions. I think that kind of sums up our prepared remarks, but glad to answer any questions there may be or go into anything further at this point.
Have anything?
Sir, what would it take for us to focus a little more on small cap, as far as board education or whatever? It just seems that that might be a way to diversify our portfolio without going into something like private equity, which is even more increased risk in the very risky portfolio as it is, which has done very well for us. But it just seems a small cap, if we had several percent in it, might be a better diversifier.
Small cap equity? Sorry, I couldn't hear perfectly, so I just want to make sure I'm answering the right question.
Yeah, to look into
Yeah.
increasing small cap equity.
Sure. So that's something, let's see, after the last asset liability study, we took time to look through each asset category and the implementation of each asset category. And if you'll remember, there was actually a higher overweight to small cap within the portfolio at that time. And that had really driven a higher level of volatility within the total portfolio over time that as the board kind of looked at total volatility for the portfolio, adding infrastructure, potentially trying to rein in some of the absolute volatility of the portfolio. That was another area that the small cap overweight was actually reduced to achieve that goal. So I think one thing we can do following the asset liability study is take time to kind of go through that process of again of evaluating each asset category and the implementation of each on an individual basis, so domestic equity, international equity, et cetera. But remember that you do have an overweight to small cap within international still as well. So I think that active risk is certainly present within the portfolio, and it's something we can talk more about as we do a deeper dive on each asset category going forward.
Okay, so it's considered higher risk to small cap.
Small cap, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Other comments, questions? I don't see any other questions or comments. We hope that when you come back, there won't be as much reading on our pages, but thank you, all of you from Callan, for being with us today. We appreciate it. And we will see you sometime after Christmas, right?
I think we're going to see you in December to talk about some real estate.
Okay, all right. And we'll see you in December. Thank you.
So good seeing you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks all.
Okay. So we are on to item number 6, discussion regarding administrative report. And I'll turn it over to Beth.
Thank you. Chair Smith. And for the record, there's no public comment because we don't have any public left. The reminder of that the fiduciary waiver of recourse premium is due, a check for $9. Please provide to Judy. That provides you with fiduciary liability coverage as your role as a trustee here. We rolled out a new online educational reporting tool. It has been used by 2 folks. Thank you both, Kathy and Jim. We hope that makes it a little easier for you to report your educational sessions that you attend.
I know Jim is doing it, we're just copying.
If I may just interject, is that one of the topics of the roundtable that we participated on was, do you have to fill out a form like this?
Or do you just orally do it?
Well, I will thank Jerry for making the suggestion at our last meeting.
Yep.
And I'd like, if I might, Madam Chair, I'd like to thank our executive director and Judy for picking that up. And that's not the only little thing that I've mentioned over your tenure, but whenever I have, all of a sudden it's magically there, you know, like the glossary and this is another one. I'm very appreciative.
Jerry, did you ask for this online form?
Jerry did.
Being a non-computer techie, you asked for the online form?
As long as I don't have to print it out, because I have a non-functional printer, but this way I can just send it down.
Well, it was easy to do. I appreciate it. I'm surprised Jerry asked for it.
I do use a computer. I know, because I haven't done it yet. I've been a little wrapped up in a kitchen and a birthday.
Yeah.
So I did want to point out one of the staff projects was that we did some member outreach where we went around and visited with the departments of the county and both of our other plan sponsors and delivered some flyers on retirement information and some candy as part of a Halloween outreach.
Who did the flyer?
That was a combination of like 4 people working on it. So it's pretty much everybody.
Yeah. Very, very good.
And we will be planning some member outreach in 2023 based around MSER's 75 years of service. So if there's no other questions or anything regarding anything on the administrative report, that wraps up my presentation. Okay.
Yes, Trustee Jurdy.
Yes, I wanted to thank staff for putting together the flyer. I think it was an all-employee email that went out that that you might be talking about. I got it in my email yesterday, talking about kind of basics about how to think about retirement planning, including, and there was a quick reference at the bottom to the contact information for the 457 plans. And I think you did update also the website to give people that information. I'm not sure yet if HR's updated the HR page that also will have those contacts, but I know that that's in the works. And I don't know if it will be a welcome proposal, but Supervisor Hashak and I put in a request that the leadership classes consider offering a session on retirement planning that people could attend, at least the employees that are participating in the leadership initiative. Ideally be for everybody, but because we think that there's a lot of outreach and just sharing of information. It's not financial planning, but just sort of sharing anecdotal information that might be helpful to the employees that are interested in planning their future.
And we will be rolling out a pre-retirement seminar probably in the first quarter. We're still nailing down some specifics with staff scheduling, but that is in the works coming soon. And yes, after we did our walk around and visited departments, we did send out the same flyer via all county email. So the folks that we didn't actually get to see and we didn't drop off, obviously, in the flyers for every single person, that they would get it in their county email.
Well done.
Yes. That's good. So I have a comment about your board performance evaluation, because you did send out questions via email a week or two ago. And you put in here that the board will need to decide whether to solicit for a consultant. And after reading through the questions and having gone through many board performance evaluations in the past, I just don't see the need to hire a consultant. But I know when I read the policy that we need to identify somebody to administer this. So my question was whether if that is a staff member, it doesn't say that it should be a board member because we're evaluating ourselves. So I don't know whether you have somebody who has the time to do that if we came up with a question.
The policy does have the chair of the board appoint like a facilitator to assist with the process. That could be someone from the board to work with me in development of some of the questions to make sure they're specifically addressing any concerns that the board may have. Or it could be someone to work with the consultant. Now, the questions that were sent out, most of those were examples of questions that had been from systems that did use a consultant. So you're seeing the types of questions you would see even if we did engage with a consultant based on the samples that I got from a couple other jurisdictions. But yes, I think I would be involved with it. And then the other one would be someone perhaps on the board as that facilitator to make sure that the questions being selected have an opportunity to incorporate any board feedback, whether we want to handle it as you actually assigning someone in sort of that facilitator position, or just emailing me topics that you want to make sure get included in the board self-evaluation.
Well, I think being the first time that we've done this, right? We have done, Sarah Board has not evaluated themselves in the past.
That's correct.
I would say that from the 3 or 4 pages of questions, there are some good questions in there. And I would think that we could just choose some of those to start with, and maybe down the road, after we try this for a while, maybe we would want a consultant to come in and help us refine the process. The first time around, I think it would be fairly easy to select some of those questions and give it a try. And I am concerned about the timing of it because our terms expire in November, and normally we would want to do this at the end of terms, but because we aren't making any changes right now, right? Like we got re-elected, then we could go ahead and go through this spring.
We can certainly do it this spring. The facilitator can be an MSERA staff member or an outside consultant. It doesn't need to be anybody on the board. I just want to make sure that we have an opportunity to get any concerns that the board may have incorporated into any questionnaire that is distributed. I'm happy to spearhead putting that together, and we don't have to aim for November, although that was in the policy, or says for other data as decided by the board. So whatever the board is comfortable with. But if we were going to hire somebody, I needed to make sure that I had enough lead up time to find a consultant for that. But obviously, a little bit of that pressure is off if the board's direction is to not use a consultant, but just utilize the sample questions that I've seen from other systems.
Not all.
Some of them. I pulled a number of questions from a couple, just so you can see the variety of things.
No, I thought I saw you. Okay, all right. Anybody have comments about the board evaluation? I know the policy we adopted in September, but we didn't really talk about it a lot. And now we're down to getting it done.
Well, and you can propose maybe taking the evaluation process around May to July timeframe to sort of coincide with the period of time that your committee would be doing my evaluation. So we can certainly aim for that if that's the board's preference. We can pick any date that you'd like.
Well, I have an opinion, but what do other people think?
Well, I put my mouth in it. I really think this board functions well. And I've been on a lot of boards and chaired members at the state level. It was a totally different situation than that. But I think we like each other. I think we know what we're doing. And I think that our staff at this point is absolutely very. It just seems this is not the right time.
I only brought it forward because it was specifically an item in the strategic plan that the board adopted to incorporate annual board self-evaluation. Now, I did make the policy a little more flexible that the board could choose its frequency and the timing of it. But that's being brought forward because it was a specific item that the consultant had put in your strategic plan that was adopted by this board as far as a goal and objective of, a specific action item.
And one of our objectives in working further on the executive director performance evaluation is to align it with the strategic plan. And if the strategic plan says do this, and we can't judge Doris on not doing it if we don't do it. So what does she have a control over and what does she not? So I'm fine with waiting. I don't think May or June is a good time frame for board members because some people are just going to be on for 5 months before they have to do that.
Well, we could bring it back October-ish of next year, 23. So not do one this year, but more or less start the process and get it aligned to present the results of the November meeting, and start that process in the September-October timeframe.
So I would like to we've got the process down in the policy, but I would like to get the questions and the format done well ahead of that. And then do the first evaluation next October. Does that work for everybody? I don't see any negatives.
So I'm going to take to the board direction is to work on the questionnaire and that it will come back in the fall of 2023 for an actual evaluation of the board.
But the questionnaire will come back before then.
Absolutely, I can bring it back whenever you like.
Whenever you have time to do that.
If there's an opinion about how many questions should be incorporated, I take any feedback you have so I can make sure hopefully to cover enough topics that the board feels the evaluation was in-depth enough, but not so many questions that you feel overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the survey.
My opinion is that there should be some questions relating to what Jerry mentioned, how the board functions as a whole, and also some questions as to how individual board members prepare.
Where you're rating just yourself.
Yes, yeah. And probably more on the side of how the board operates as a whole. So I don't know.
And if you don't mind, I'll go ahead and include sort of the educational assessment so we can get some information on what kind of educational topics the board might want brought back in the fall.
I might suggest for those of you that haven't looked through all of those questions that were sent out, maybe you'll send them again.
I'd be happy to send them again.
Okay, I think if you would just read through them and identify whatever 5 or 6 that you think are important and send them to Doris, that might be helpful.
That would be great.
Okay, so you wouldn't mind taking that task on, everyone, that would be wonderful to do. And I think we can just make the first time kind of simple and see how it goes and see what kind of responses we get. I'm gonna say the same for the executive director's performance evaluation. The value of any of these evaluations come in how much effort we put into the verbal responses and checking a box that, yes, I prepare for every meeting adequately or whatever. It doesn't tell us anything. If we have comments that would help us do our job better as a board or as an individual trustee, that's what we want to get to. So I'm just a huge proponent of using evaluations to improve things, not to just check off a list that we got it done. So, anything else on the director's report? Okay. We are moving on then to general board member discussion. You know, Jim, if you wanted to report it on our roundtable.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Kathy and I joined the virtual CalPERS trustee roundtable last Friday. And there were 2 primary topics. One where we have a presenter on ESG investing. And then the second one was on the development of strategic plans and how those are incorporated into the daily activities or the association's activities. And it was very interesting because there was a real broad spectrum across the systems. ESG, everything from folks feeling like that's really going to drive, where your returns are in the future, to other systems that don't, and large successful systems that don't even consider it as a factor and feel as if it's essentially yet another kind of something that's going to come and go, almost like an investing fad. So there was a real spectrum there. But I thought the presentation was excellent. If you haven't attended the CalPERS virtual roundtable, this was my first. The educational component of it was excellent. And then the strategic planning, it seemed as if MCR was actually done well, comparable to other boards on where we're at strategic planning. Yeah, and how we're using it and so forth. Again, there was the full spectrum of folks that felt like the world is so reactive that strategic plans tend to handcuff you and be something that you don't want, to those that incorporate it very deeply and intricately into their work. So it was I thought it was interesting, not only what I learned, but also what I learned about the differences from system to system of how they're functioning.
Yes, very, very agree. The lady who spoke on ESG was Mel, and she comes on TV once in a while on Bloomberg or whatever. Anyway, she was interesting. I thought she was very knowledgeable. You could certainly tell which political realm she lives in. That bothered me a lot to be on a seminar when somebody was so strongly one way or the other. But anyway, it was a good round.
Which political, right or left?
Very far left. Yes. So, any other general board member comments? All right, then. We are ready to adjourn the meeting. The next meeting will be on Wednesday, December 14th at 8:30. And as far as we know right now, it can still be hybrid.
Yes, I expect to run hybrid meetings through the end of February. I believe that's when the governor had extended the AB 360 After that, we'd be looking at operating under the existing Brown Act rules and the new AB 2443, I think it was, that was recently signed, but those have certain restrictions and conditions that apply. Jeff, we can bring down those later before we move into operating under those rules if you'd like.
Madam Chair, before you adjourn, we've got an audit committee coming up, and Judy, is it possible to move the time back?
Well, the next audit committee meeting was scheduled quite some months ago, and we determined it would be on November 17th at 2 p.m., but Jerry has a little bit of conflict and wanted to see if the committee would agree to maybe trying to move that meeting back to 2:30 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Of course, that would have be up to Brown Armstrong and whether or not they can also make that change. I think we've got a couple of committee members still with us here. So Catherine and
Jerry, there's 4, Jerry, Catherine, Katniss, Jim, and
was it Dan?
it might have been Dan. I don't remember. I'm sorry.
There's one meeting, one doctor a month out of town, I cannot.
We can look into that and we can advise the committee if we can alter that time. If not, we will miss you.
Well, I may be able to get here as part of it, depending on how long it goes on.
And it's going to be Zoom, so they're not coming up in person, and it'll be a virtual audit committee meeting on the 17th. And we can look into pushing that time back just a little.
Even a half hour would help.
That would be fine with me. I have no issues with that at all.
Could you just repeat the date and time of the proposed meeting?
Thursday, November 17th. It's currently scheduled at 2 p.m.
Okay, and that's the time you're looking at for, or you're looking to change it to a different time?
She'd like us to move it down to maybe 2:30 or 3 p.m. So it would just be later in the day.
I had a doctor's appointment in Sonoma County, I cannot.
Yeah, no problem. That's fine.
All right, so we'll check with Brown Armstrong if they can push it a little later that afternoon. We'll let all the committee members know.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, well, we can call the meeting adjourned at 11. Mine says 29, that is wrong, but 11:30. All right, guys, thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Bye.
Happy Thanksgiving to everybody not on audit.
That's right.